Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Elite Team Strategist, and Board Director, helping folks reframe hot topic conversations from difficult to different. And we are back with my very special guests, Jason Eisner and Neil Pretty, co-founders of Aristotle Performance and the sponsors of our upcoming Psych Safety Day, featuring Dr. Amy Edmondson, the author of The Fearless Organization and her latest book, The Right Kind of Wrong. Welcome back, gentlemen. I can't wait to dig in.
Great to be back.
Great to be back. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. You said something in our last conversation. Well, you said a lot of things, but a couple of statements that really stuck with me were psychological safety is about telling the truth in real time and testing the edges. Now, the election is behind us. And it might be a good time to explore an unwritten rule of days long past, where people were advised to avoid publicly discussing religion and politics and instead discuss weather and sports because they were considered safe topics. And I dare say that they are. My guess is that that's because religion and politics are so deeply personal that we've forgotten how to disagree without being disagreeable. So that being said, when you consider the fact that psychological safety is telling the truth in real time, and it's also partly testing the edges, how do we, if we dare, have these conversations around politics, especially since the elections are now over?
I'm actually curious to hear from Neil. Neil's a Canadian, so has the advantage of being, a slight outsider observer of, I think American politics is different.
Crazy. Yeah.
American politics is very different than Canadian politics. And we probably talk about American politics more than we talk about Canadian politics because it's so much more entertaining.
Oh, thanks. Entertaining is one way to put it, but that's not a word we use.
It kind of goes back to, in our last conversation, you mentioned the certification that we do. And when we started that certification, one of the things that it was missing that we recognized very early on was training around dialogue. And in the North American market, particularly in the US, there is this preference for debate. And when you debate someone, your primary goal is to debase them. It's to break apart the foundation of their argument. Mm-hmm. And when you're in dialogue, the dialogue means the flow of meaning. You're trying to gain more meaning, more understanding. This is like the heart of learning. You're trying to understand instead of destroy. Mm. In our certification, we started training this concept and like, how do you as a facilitator generate dialogue within a group? What are the elements that are needed? What kind of inquiry is needed? How do you maintain the edges of the dialogue so that it's still relevant, right? These kinds of components became very important, particularly in the North American market, because of this preference towards debate. So if you seek to debase your opponent, you will inevitably end up with an opponent. You'll make them into that more than if you would be seeking to understand their perspective. Because the reality is people are making choices based on their values, and more often our values are closely aligned, or we can at least understand and give grace to other people when we understand, oh, you're coming from this worldview or this value, and this is what this is why it matters to you. This is what it impacts for you. We're much more gracious to each other when we understand those things than when we create each other as opponents.
Okay, you've just said a lot that I want to unpack. And the minute you said debase, I'm sure I felt a reaction that I'm sure the community saw. So let's go back to that, because I'm one who really likes to understand words that I'm going to be using, because I'm really intentional about the word choices that I make. So go back to debate equals debase, because we see debating as a mental exercise.
Yeah.
But you have just reframed it in a way that never occurred to me, because when you debase someone, you really are tearing them down. And it's not so much about listening to understand, it's listening to get a dig in. Let's talk about that a little bit more, because that's our nature here, but I don't think people realize, or maybe that's how it has gotten so contentious, is because we've really gotten into the debase part without really thinking about it. So say a little bit more about that. I am so intrigued.
So, I mean, I love the origins of words as well. I mean, when my daughter asks me questions about things, she's 9, I'll often, refer to the Latin root of what words mean. If you understand Latin, you can understand the world in the English world. Debase is the Latin meaning of debate. It's not like it's not a reframe, it's the frame. And debate is the origin of democracy, because ultimately, to have a democracy, what you had was, a couple of people arguing about what should be in the future, and then whoever could get the most people to agree with them won the day. But do we want that around the dinner table or the office? Is that really the goal? And part of the reason why it's not the goal is because we're not vying for power. We're vying for a solution. So debate doesn't necessarily help us when we're trying to solve problems. It helps us when we're trying to gain power and control a future narrative. So like debate isn't the right way forward if we want those things. So debate is part of democracy and necessary as part of that world. But where and when do we want it in our office and, around the boardroom and around the dinner table?
But a debate doesn't have to be ugly. And over the years, debating has evolved into something that is just so full of vitriol and tense, and it's just plain ugly. And I have taught classes where we would do mock debates, and people were pleasant. They still got their point across. They were still very firm in their opinion, but it didn't get ugly. And I don't think that helps things. How do we get back from that?
I think there's the idealistic answer is that people could ask more questions. Being in it, being surrounded, I don't know. I actually don't know, because it feels like in line with the social media, debates are now designed to be for views. That's right. So I don't see us becoming more civilized in that way. So I don't
That's
I think the answer lies in, this. Okay, when we were talking about psychological safety, real-time reality, the hardest part about psychological safety is realizing that we, particularly leaders, are the key instrument in that change. And what we notice when we go into organizations is people go, "Hey, everybody else needs to change. I'm good."
Right.
It's like, well, hold on a second.
Right. That attitude is not helping.
Right. And it's and you're not a bad person for wanting everybody else to come to your way of doing things. That's pretty natural. So I think when it comes to Jason, you mentioned the influence of social media. It's a level of awareness that I think people avoid, because as soon as you're self-aware, you become responsible.
Yes.
And that's a burden. Right. So it's I think that's where people falter with this is, formulating a good argument in a debate that's not about the other person, that's about the idea. That's hard. And if you're self-aware and you're realizing that you're making it personal and going after somebody, or you're taking it personal and you're getting hurt by it, then you become responsible for those emotions. Responsible for those actions, and that's much more challenging than just getting mad and saying that, "God, we shouldn't have talked about politics at the dinner table."
Yeah. Last month we were a very dear friend of mine, Terry Wilson. We ran a series on discussing hot topics without torching relationships, and in part of that series we talked about what's your ownership. For instance, if you really, really value the relationship, you might want to avoid having these discussions altogether. Or if you realize in the middle of a conversation, it's best to disengage respectfully so that you can protect the relationship. It's not a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom. Or are you owning your triggers? We pretty much know the topics and the words that trigger us. And if we walk into these conversations with the understanding that I'm most likely to get triggered, then maybe we might not want to have those conversations. So I agree with you 100%. Raised awareness requires responsibilities, and you are responsible for your response. So when we think about those things, let's end this conversation by giving our community of listeners some tips. So next week, Thanksgiving, these discussions are going to happen whether we want them to or not, whether we invite them or not. Jason, I know that in particular, you would like to talk about Thanksgiving from the perspective of rituals. Help us in that sense so that we can have a Thanksgiving dinner that's not tolerable, but actually something to be thankful for.
Yeah, I think a lot about rituals, right? We have daily rituals. Like every morning I wake my daughter up, I feed her a bottle the same way. Like, she has her nighttime routine. We have these daily rituals. Neil and I meet every Monday and Friday. And they have specific agendas. Like these are our weekly rituals. So I think about Thanksgiving as this annual ritual where it's showing our values. It's living our values, right? In this case, the value of gratitude and appreciation. Thanksgiving is always like get the family together. So it's this value of family. We're celebrating the food and the harvest and all of these things. And I think it's just really important to remember, like, what are we ritualizing? And, Thanksgiving is, a challenging holiday. There's this Ram Dass quote, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family. Like, it puts you back into all of that mindset, however it was with your family. But I think if you can kind of focus on, like, what is the ritual that we're celebrating and creating, that might just be a better place to come from.
Neil, what would you have to add to that?
Geez, I mean, I always love Jason's perspective on these things, because when we talk about psychological safety, we, Jason and I in particular have like invested in our lives in the last episode, but like we also sort of practice on our families.
Your families are your guinea pigs. Okay.
Our pilot that we fail on,
fail with the family.
Yeah. But I think that, so I love the way he speaks about rituals, and I think it goes back to something that he also said earlier that I referenced to, which is being intentional instead of habitual. If you see your family sliding into an old ritual of argument, debate instead of dialogue, like, have the courage, have the pluck to try something different and see where it goes. And one of the things that I've started really, sort of putting out there in the world is that all of the behaviors that we, share with people, all the strategies that we share with people, all the tactics, they all come down to two characteristics: curiosity and courage. Yeah. Those two things drive that. So if you want to have something different, you have to be courageous to some degree and curious to see where it goes.
I would agree with that. And I would also add compassionate. I mean, can we just come together with the sense of compassion that this is our family, and maybe just set that aside? One of the traditions that we have is we always go around the Thanksgiving table and literally talk about what we're thankful for. And if nothing else, we can definitely all do that. And I am very thankful for my two dear friends, Jason Eisner and Neil Pretty, co-founders of Aristotle Performance. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen, for this pretty special broadcast just before the Thanksgiving holiday. And community, I'm taking next Thursday off. I'm going to be sitting around the Thanksgiving table, being grateful and eating. So I hope you're doing the same. And if this podcast helped you to reframe the difficult or hot topic conversations from difficult to different, please share it with your network, with your own comments, because this is a learning community. So I want to hear what you have to say. In the meantime, please stay in the flow with me, follow, like, and overshare any podcast that help you to reframe hot topic conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed, keep it real, and happy Thanksgiving.